Welcome to Experts Insights, the podcast by Experts Institut. Here, you'll gain insights into the world of business consulting and GxP. In this episode, we focus on the topic of supplier qualification. Pharmacist Dietmar Gross explains what supplier qualification entails, why it is particularly crucial in the pharmaceutical industry, and how the process unfolds. Additionally, you'll also hear about the common challenges that frequently arise in this area. If you're interested in learning more about the procedures, necessity, and regional differences in supplier qualification, stay tuned. Hello and welcome to a new episode of Experts Insights. I'm Franziska Schwarz and I'm delighted to be talking to pharmacist and GxP consultant Dr. Dietmar Gross again today. We've already recorded several interesting episodes on GMP topics in German, so if you're interested in those, feel free to check them out. Hello Dietmar, good to speak to you again today.
It's great to be together today for this podcast.
Today we are looking at the topic of supplier qualification, an important process in a GMP environment. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to tell us about it. To start things off, could you explain to our listeners what supplier qualification actually means?
Well, when you operate a pharmaceutical business, you draw upon all kinds of players in various industries, suppliers of raw materials, packaging materials, but also suppliers of services, all things that your company does not really produce or generate or create itself. And so you have to utilize suppliers who specialize in these services or in the manufacturing of these materials. And so using those instead of doing these things yourself is actually a little bit risky because you give control over these things out of your hand. You actually use the services or the materials of another entity that is not inside your own quality system. And so it's a little bit tricky. So you take somewhat of a risk of using someone else's material. It's kind of normal that you have suppliers instead of making the raw materials yourself, but still, you give this kind of out of your hand a little bit. And that's why it's important to qualify, to make sure that these suppliers are qualified. They're actually capable of supplying you with material or services that are actually good enough for what you're intending to do with them.
And what role does it play in the GMP quality management system, and who are the suppliers in this context?
Well, it is a requirement to have qualified suppliers and service providers. So it is something that the GMP regulations require of a pharmaceutical business to be part of their quality management. So you have to have some procedures and processes and workflows in place to make sure that anything that is used from an external entity in production, it may not even just be a material or packaging or raw material, it may also be just material for disinfection, cleaning agents, all kinds of things, laboratory reagents, lab supplies. You have to make sure that all these are part of your system of supplier qualification. Otherwise, your quality system is not GMP compliant. So it's very important to compliance of your quality management system. So that's why this is so important. And the suppliers in that context, that can be all kinds of things. That can even be a software provider who supplies you with a software for material management or for controlling a QC device. It can also be a software that you use for electronic document management. Software suppliers, reagent suppliers. It can also be a service provider. Some companies subsumize this as vendors. So they call vendors anything that supplies a material to you, and also anyone who supplies a service to you, such as, a company that sends in their people to clean your premises after work hours, or a service provider who sends in people to calibrate your measuring devices periodically. Those external services, and they would also then fall under the main header of vendors or suppliers here.
Okay, thank you for the good explanation. What is also important to clarify right at the beginning is, why is supplier qualification important?
We talked about that it's important to the compliance of the quality system. Otherwise, you're not doing GMP if you're not doing this. But of course, there is a reality to this importance. If you get kind of blindsided by what quality your supplier sends you or how well they work, or how much experience they have, or how capable they in reality actually are. If you're blindsided by that, you may use materials and they travel all the way through the processes in your establishment, all the way to the final pharmaceutical product. And then this material, which maybe, for instance, may contain an impurity or may just have some other issue, all this travels into the final product and then it goes actually into the patient. And so qualifying a supplier means you take care and make sure by all kinds of measures that whatever you get supplied with is suitable, has the right quality, it comes from the right processes, it is manufactured the correct way, it is tested the correct way, so it actually fits to your processes, to your product, and that the product that you supplied the market with then later is not in any way adulterated, it has no impurities in it. And if you kind of skip or skimp on supply qualification of suppliers, the services or the materials can be so bad that people actually get harmed by it. And then, of course, you as a pharmaceutical company are responsible for these damages. So it has a real, it has a real consequence if you don't qualify suppliers adequately.
Thank you very much. That's a good introduction to the topic, and we now have a good understanding of why supplier qualification is necessary. Now I would like to delve deeper into the process and procedure of supplier qualification. Dietmar, what are the typical contents of a supplier qualification?
Yeah, the way you ask the question is actually pretty good because, I mean, there are some requirements in GMP guidelines what you're supposed to do in a supplier qualification. It's not too specific, and so the industry has kind of come up with their own way of doing it. Something that is pretty normal is that, first of all, you need to understand how you want to source your suppliers. If you're looking for a new supplier for a raw material, for instance, or for an active substance for a pharmaceutical product, you kind of screen the market, and of course, and you look for suppliers who can provide you with some information about themselves. So typically, you request information about a supplier, about the business, about the quality system they have, about the policies they have. It's typically a questionnaire that you send in first. But that is, of course, not qualifying the supplier. Just because you get a questionnaire filled out doesn't mean any of that is true. It's just an indication that they might be a suitable partner, and you may actually be able to purchase materials from those entities that are suitable to the task. So the questionnaire is one thing you do to pre-select suppliers, but questionnaires are actually not mandatory. So there's no GMP text I'm aware of, nowhere in the world, that requires questionnaires for supplier qualification. What companies instead do is that they actually purchase then samples, for example, of raw materials. And the supplier sends samples, and based on these samples, the pharmaceutical company can do quality testing. They can check on the quality, make sure that it meets all the pharmaceutical requirements. So that is another thing, analytical testing. And then there is another thing you do. Obviously, you want to see if using a certain supplier's material, your own final product can be produced within the required specifications. Sometimes when you have a raw material and you change your supplier, it's possible that, let's say you manufacture tablets or capsules, that these tablets do not suffice the quality criteria anymore because the supplier of the material has changed. And so what many companies do is they do a feasibility test when they purchase a material from a new supplier. So they don't really go into the business relationship with the supplier permanently unless they have actually tested the supplier's material in a couple of their own products. So that's important. So questionnaire, analytical testing of materials, for instance, then feasibility batches, feasibility studies. And another very important thing, of course, is then to actually visit those suppliers. For many suppliers, on-site audits is something that is even required in some GMP regulations. So you look actually through the supplier's quality system, to talk to the people who are responsible, you interview coworkers there, or employees there, not coworkers. And of course, you look into their processes, you go through their rooms, everything you do at an audit, during an audit. So those are the most important things. And finally, if everything can be agreed on, There's going to be a contract, a quality agreement, those things you draw up to make sure the supplier is bound to your policies as well. And he's then legally required, to always keep up with the newest regulations, with sending the right quality, and so forth. So those are the basic elements of a supplier qualification.
So are there no official GMP requirements?
For the elements of a supplier qualification, there's really only the requirement of you have to have thorough knowledge of the supplier. You have to have a business relationship. You have to have a knowledge and experience with that supplier, ideally with the material or the service you've been using. So you cannot just go ahead and choose a supplier. So a purchasing department cannot just go ahead and look for something and just take the first one they get because he's cheap. It has to be an approval process in place. And the basis for this is really you have adequate knowledge of the supplier and of the material or service you're purchasing for your purposes. So there's not a whole lot of more specifics in GxP guidelines or GMP guides, at least not in official legally binding documents. One thing that is required for some critical materials you buy, for instance, the active substance of a drug product, or primary packaging materials like syringes, glass, or blister foil for tableting. For those materials, for instance, the European GMP guide requires that companies have to do on-site audits and check and see how the supplier actually works and if they can rely on whatever the supplier says in documents and certificates, and if they can rely on the quality of the material.
Okay, and what criteria are used to assess the suitability of a supplier?
Yeah, so obviously there's even more to assessing the suitability of a supplier than just the quality of the product. What is really important when you purchase, let's take the example of a raw material again, something you want to use as part of your recipe for a pharmaceutical product. It is very important that you understand how well the supplier himself is working in his quality system. So how do the suppliers ascertain quality of what they send you? Is there a defined process? Is there maybe a good process control in place? Is there something in place that tells me I can feel good about purchasing there? I can be sure that the quality is always up to par. So process management, quality assurance, typical things you would actually then assess, especially during an audit, be it an on-site audit, sometimes even a paper-based audit, which is rare, but it in some cases you can do that. And of course, then typically you also perform a periodic evaluation of suppliers, and then you look back through the last maybe 12 months and see, have there been any issues with that supplier? Has there been any delivery issues or delays in delivery, or some issues with whatever was delivered, the quality, those kind of things. And so that's how you assess. You also assess if the supplier has even enough people to work in a way that makes sure the quality is fine, if the people are educated well enough, if they're trained well enough. So you essentially look, especially during the audit of the supplier, through the entire system, through the premises, and all those impressions in the end have to then lead to the decision whether or not the supplier is acceptable or not.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, audits are an important part of the qualification process. I assume that these are not just carried out once, but at regular intervals to ensure that the standards continue to be met. How often should supplier audits be carried out?
Yeah, so the audits that a company would do, I mean, some companies have a policy that they say, well, really critical materials, we have to visit our supplier every 2 years, maybe others every 4 years. So there's no specific or specified frequency for audits and re-audits in GMP regulations or guidance documents. But obviously you have to re-audit a supplier and cannot just say, well, we're just going to visit there one time, everything was fine when we visited, and so we're going to trust this company for the next 50 years. That's not realistic. There's a lot of changes that are happening at the company, at the supplier or service provider. So it is only reasonable and plausible and only makes sense to redo these audits once in a while And so each company has its own policy and document that specifies how often you have to re-audit a company. And the more critical a material or service is to you as a pharmaceutical or production entity, the more critical it is, the more often you would probably go do your audit at the supplier.
Okay, so it's very individual, but this means that even qualified suppliers must be continuously monitored in order to maintain compliance. It's very interesting.
Right. And, when we were talking about the criteria of how you assess a supplier or service provider, it probably should be said as well that, there's no one size fits all system here. You cannot roll out the same standard over all your suppliers. Depending on the type of material or service you want to purchase, you have to look before you actually qualify this service provider or supplier. You have to look and see what are they supplying. What is important in that material for us? What are the quality characteristics that need to be really there? And so what mechanisms, what quality assurance mechanisms do we need to see, for instance, during an audit at the supplier? So most of the time, these suppliers do not even have to suffice a fully GMP compliant system, but at least a part of it that makes sure whatever you purchase there is fine.
As we have often made the comparison between the EU and the US in previous episodes, I wonder, are there also regional differences in supply qualification, for example, regarding regulatory requirements?
Yeah, the expectations from the regulatory agencies are pretty similar, but the texts that are underlying these expectations do differ quite a bit. So when we look into the European Union documents, let's just look into the regular GMP guide for the European Union. So for instance, when we talk about finished pharmaceutical production, there's, let's say, Chapter 5, when it's about production. There we have sections and text sections in there that are very clear that say you have to, for instance, have to carry out on-site audits at certain supplier types, for instance, active substances, primary packaging materials, those kind of things. So there's certain supplier types that you must always also qualify by auditing. Others, you're free to decide how you want to qualify them based on risk to the patient in the end. In the US, it's a little different. In the US, the main text that spells out GMP or CGMP there is 21 CFR 211. And in those subchapters that deal with pharmaceutical GMP, there's really not a lot about supplier qualification in there, especially when it comes to auditing of suppliers. There's hardly anything in there. Like in the European Union, you even have requirements of what an audit report is supposed to look like. But in the US, especially when it comes to suppliers of materials, technically, if it's just about 21 CFR 211, technically you could probably boil down your qualification of a supplier to simply have kind of contract with them, not necessarily doing an audit there, but doing a lot of testing when the material is delivered. So you do a lot of QC testing, and based on the QC testing, you can, I'm not going to say you can substitute, for instance, audits, but the way the text is written in 21 CFR 211, it doesn't really require audits there. And yet, US FDA expects supplier audits, of course. So in the end, the text in the European Union requires more concerning audits and specific text. But then the practical reality in the US probably will require even more audits, although the text doesn't even require it so much. So yeah, there are differences, but the problem is really rather that you need to know the expectations that are tied to these texts. And you have to know really well how to interpret these 21 CFR texts, for instance, in guidance for industry documents.
So, who is stricter?
Yeah, that's a little bit difficult to say. I would say there's not a whole lot of difference. In the end, the more audits, the more suppliers you actually qualify also by audits and periodic re-audits, the happier the regulatory authorities will be. Because you just exercise more control over your suppliers and your supply chain. I would say that in certain areas, the European Union might be more strict, and in other areas, the US might be more strict. For example, when you purchase an active substance for manufacturing a final product for the market, you purchase the active substance, but then you have to audit not only the manufacturer of the active substance, but you also need to know where the raw materials for the active substance production are coming from. So you have to go way back into the supply chain, and that's even literally said and written in the European GMP guide. You don't have anything of the like in the US regulations. So in that sense, supply chain management is a little bit more intense, at least in the text in the European Union, than in the US. And yet, depending on who you get in an FDA inspection, you may be confronted with the same expectation, although it's not written in any text. So, in the end, it's not going to be a whole lot of a difference. And so I think it's pretty much comparable what's expected.
Okay, thank you. Now I would like to talk about the challenges and difficulties and what are the biggest challenges in supplier qualification, especially in the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah, the biggest challenge, like right off the bat, is to keep up with all your audits you have to do. I mean, keeping quality system, keeping lists of approved or maybe not anymore approved suppliers, that's the one thing. But keeping up with all the measures and all the doings you have to do to keep up that qualification status, that's a lot of work. I mean, let's say you are a company that is manufacturing tablets or solid dosage forms, and you have just 50, maybe 100 products as a contract manufacturing organization. And then you have hundreds of supplying companies that are all relevant, and most of them you may have to perform audits at, and that every 3 or 4 years. Who's going to make all and do all the audits? It's a lot of money. I mean, you send someone to an audit, the travel costs money, the time that's spent during the audit, putting the report together, pursuing the reply to the audit report, checking on CAPA. That's a lot of money that goes down. I'm not going to say down the drain, but it has to be spent. And you have to spend this again and again every few years. And you have to, first of all, find all these people who can do these audits for you, because it's just a hefty amount of work and of resources that has to be put into this. And the regulatory agencies have really not relented when it comes to this at all. So it has to be done. And that is a major chunk of work that also would drive the price of the final product a little bit, I would think. So that's a big challenge. Also keeping up with the regulatory development, keeping up with the contracts, the quality agreement, that can be a challenge. But the biggest issue probably is to actually take care of all your audit planning and scheduling.
And are there typical weak points during the process that occur again and again?
Yeah, I would say so. The issue is for some companies that, since the GMP guidance documents speak of qualification of suppliers, it's a little bit tricky to actually act on that. I mean, qualifying a supplier, you go to a company that supplies you with 10 different materials, and then you go there in an audit or do qualification measures, and then you qualify that company, and but then you have qualified that supplier, but for what material? So you go there, you inspect or audit the premises for one or two of these materials, but the truth is you purchased 10 or 15 that you haven't looked into. So the weak point is in the definition that you have to qualify the supplier. A better term, and that's actually a term that's applied a lot, especially in biotech companies like biological drug manufacturers, is instead of supplier qualification, they would say it is qualification of materials. So you don't really qualify the supplier and then you say, hey, that's a great supplier. Whatever we buy from him is fine. That is pretty naive. You can't qualify a supplier for anything he does. You have to qualify a supplier for the one thing or the 10 different things you purchase from him. So you have to be very specific and look into what that company actually does with the stuff you purchase there. So, and that's why a lot of companies have changed their system from the term of supplier qualification to material or service qualification, because you don't qualify in an abstract manner a company or entity, but you qualify the material you want to use from them and the service you want to employ in your own quality system. So there's a system-based or a viewpoint-based weak point that if you approach supplier qualification under that term, you may actually miss to qualify the actual material or the actual service you're going to use. And of course, again, time and again, it really revolves about this issue of auditing. The weak point is that a lot of companies cannot keep up with their supplier audits. And so in order to circumvent that, quite a few companies we have observed in the last good decade, 1.5 decades, companies actually cut down on their audits. So they do not audit the companies they should audit. And so, of course, they get into trouble, or they do not audit them often enough. They say, well, we have audited our really important supplier 5 years ago, and now it's time to go again. Well, 5 years is a heck of a long time to not look into a critical supplier. And that is the weak point, often based on not enough resources, on not supplier qualification not being financed enough, supported enough by the monetary means. And that is the big issue. Because if you don't have this, you have no control about what you put into your own products.
Yeah, that sounds very complex and also time consuming. But what happens if a supplier does not meet the requirements? So what measures should companies take if this is the case?
I guess you could say if a supplier does not meet the requirements, and if it's a first time getting to know the new entity, then there's simply no approval of the supplier. So the supplier is not going to make business with me as a pharmaceutical company. So the supplier is going to try and accommodate to my requirements, but of course that typically means the supplier has to invest more money in quality management, quality systems, better equipment, and that will drive the price. If you already have a supplier qualified and had it qualified for quite a while, or 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and all of a sudden you find out, hey, there's a quality issue, and the supplier is not able to really fix the problem, then the supplier is typically put on a status that forbids the purchasing department to purchase any services or any materials from that supplier until the issue is fixed. And if the supplier is willing to change, then the business relationship is resumed. But if he's not willing to change, then it typically means the end of the relationship. There are other industries that have that are a little bit more lenient with their suppliers. Right now, we're talking about the context of pharmaceutical GMP and pharmaceutical products. There, the burden of qualifying material suppliers is very high. So the requirement to qualify thoroughly and also inspect and audit critical material suppliers frequently, this requirement is very literal, very specific, and very clear in the pharmaceutical area. You will not find something like that, for instance, when it comes to cosmetic industry. So when you're a cosmetic manufacturing company, there's no official requirement that you have to audit your raw material suppliers. And that's a pretty big difference to pharmaceutical GMP. Cosmetic GMP does not ask you to do audits at your raw material suppliers. So most of the time, cosmetic manufacturers have no idea what the raw material supplier companies look like from the inside. They don't know anything. So the standard that is required in pharma is very high, but it, of course, is only effective if the pharmaceutical companies also work by their systems. If a supplier messes up and doesn't fix the issue, you have to cancel a relationship with him. I'm not business relationship, but you cannot purchase the material anymore. You cannot use it for your products anymore. That's what this supplier qualification system is there for, that you follow the system once you have it set up. So that's very important.
Finally, I would like to know, how does Experts Institute support supplier qualification?
Oh yeah, there's quite a few different ways of how we have been doing this and what we do in our projects. Obviously, audits is something that we kind of major in. So audits of all types, different consumer goods industries, focuses on pharma, active substances, excipients, packaging materials, all those things. Also in the cosmetic industry, we've been doing audits for quite a while. So we know the difference between these different GMP standards. There's other areas where we do this. So audits, to help companies to keep up with all the audits they have to do, that is one thing. We've been doing this quite successfully and very effectively, if I may say so. Then, of course, not only doing the audits, but also helping companies in managing their audit units. So we, for instance, provide interim management of an audit business unit or a unit that is planning supplier qualification. So taking over an entire department, for instance, at interim, or just helping companies when they're short of staff, and if the entire system is kind of down, we come in and help to revive it again, or even to change and optimize the workflows. Some companies don't even have any supplier qualification system because they're a startup company or because they just have a deficiency there. And so they ask us to set up a system that is livable, it is plausible to work with, it is financially affordable for the company, and still meets compliance requirements. And this is also what we do. So there's quite a few different ways of how we assist and help companies in the area of supplier or material qualification.
Thank you, Dietmar, for the exciting and informative discussion. I'm delighted that you were able to join us again and give us an exciting insight into the importance and procedure of supplier audits.
Yeah, it is a lot of fun. That, as a matter of fact, is one of our most favorite project commissions we have. I mean, because it's so exciting to see all these different systems, to see all these different industries and also different suppliers, the requirements. And it's it's a lot of learning going on. Every time you deal with a supplier of a certain kind, you learn about their way of thinking. Also, if it's in a country you've never been to and the culture is different, you understand just a whole lot more about processes, about what's relevant for a certain material, what is not relevant, how much GMP is relevant, where can I be a little more lean on it, where do I have to be very firm on it, my expectations. So it's a great learning curve also involved in this, and it's a great topic, and we love to support in that area, of course.
Thank you for your attention. We hope this episode of Experts Insights offered valuable perspectives. For more updates and content, connect with us on LinkedIn or YouTube under Experts Institut. We look forward to bringing you more knowledge and expertise in our next episode of Experts Insights.